Recording started. Hi, this is Steve Hargadon, and welcome to the Future of Education. It is Thursday, February 24th, and our guests tonight are Michael Horn and Heather Staker from Insight Institute, who are going to talk to us about a couple of case studies, I think. Michael and Heather, welcome.
Thanks so much. It's good to be here.
We're glad to be here. Thank you, Steve.
Absolutely. Now, it's so funny. We got caught up in our making sure that we were getting your audio working there, Heather, that I forgot to load the rest of the slides. So what I think I'm going to do is, Michael, why don't you start out by giving a short introduction. I'll get the rest of the slides loaded, and then we'll take a quick break and go through some technical stuff and click back. And it looks like you're going to talk about two case studies, so maybe you could mention that.
Sure. Thanks so much, Steve. And once again, thank you for all the great work you do in hosting this Future of Education series and giving not just us the opportunity to talk about the research that we have ongoing, but indeed just the incredible array of people that you continue to bring in here. So a big thank you to you as well. Let's see, and hopefully we have full audio still here. But what we're going to do today is Heather Staker on the Insight Institute team has had the opportunity over the last several months, really, to basically be investigating two different case studies. One that took place in North Carolina over a connectivity initiative that they implemented to basically extend broadband access, and a second case study
when you hear
where
the
she
tone,
explored the
you will
Alabama
be the first person to join the meeting.
Case study as well. And they're both interesting looks with different spins on some interesting and similar problems that we'll have fun talking about today. And Steve, I'll kick it back to you. You just put the slides up there with the two of us, so I'm assuming that they're loaded. And I will let you talk about the mechanics of using Illuminate and some of the opportunities and find out where our audience is from.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks, everybody, for being patient. Heather, are you back on? It looked like the audio cut out there for a minute.
I'm back on. Can you hear me okay? Is there an echo? I apologize for the technical problems.
Is there an echo? I apologize for the technical problems.
No, it's not your fault, and you're doing great. And I'm not hearing an echo, although I will turn my mic off to make sure that that doesn't happen. Maybe because I had my microphone on. Future of Education is sponsored by Illuminate and Learn Central. The project I work on, the Learn Central Social Network for Educators, is at learncentral.org. It is free, and we encourage you to join us. Coming up on the Future of Education, next week, Jim Klein talks about social networking with students and student technology. We have a panel on the 3rd on unschooling. Should be a lot of fun. Kevin Kelly's rescheduled his interview on what technology wants for the week after. Hopefully there's something on that list that's attractive to you, and we'll have you join us. If you've missed one of our shows, they are all recorded. Yesterday we heard from Steve Wheeler coming in from the UK. That was a terrific show. Before that, John Seeley Brown, David Perkins, lots of fun activities and events, and they're all recorded and up at futureofeducation.com. We do have some fun crowdsourced activities at the Q and ISTE shows. Both have an EduBloggerCon the day before. Actually, at ISTE, it's just the day before. At ISTE, it's the Saturday before. At Q, it's just the day before. But go to edubloggercon.com to get more information. Both shows also have bloggers cafes. We have wireless and lots of place to spread out and talk to each other. Plus, the Unplugged series, Q Unplugged and ISTE Unplugged, where you can present at either of those shows, even if you've never presented before. We have a presentation area, and we live stream those presentations out. If this is your first time in Illuminate, it is participative. You'll see some emoticons at the bottom of the participant window, smiley face, a clapping hand. You can use those to indicate how you're feeling. You can also put messages in the chat. And if you like, it's probably easiest to go up to View Layouts and switch to the wide layout, and it makes it a little bit easier to see the chat. That's View Layouts and wide layout. Now, as Michael said, we'll give you a chance to indicate where you're participating from. Look for a wand with a red star at the end. To the left of the map, click on that, and then click on the map. And feel free to shout out in the chat as well where you're from, time, temperature. Again, we've got someone from New Zealand. Those of us who've watched closely what's happened there, keep hoping for the best. Again, we sure appreciate your being here wherever you are listening from, and especially if you're listening to the recording. Thanks for joining us. Okay, so Michael, this is kind of a departure from the previous shows we've done. The topic being more technical and related to connectivity. I think we've pretty much focused on more sort of the online learning aspects, which always touched on pedagogy. But I'm going to turn things over to you and let you talk a little bit about this. And I'll be here as your support. Let me know what I can do, and the game is yours.
Thanks so much, Steve. Really appreciate it, and glad again that all of you have joined us. We have a good audience for Steve, as you said. One of the two case studies being much more technical in thinking about infrastructure for some of this emerging world of online learning and so forth that really is continuing to grow and move in different directions in all shapes and sizes. So excited to have you all along for the ride, and excited to have Heather Staker on here as well. Heather is the co-author of these two case studies, one in North Carolina and one on Alabama, that I just put the links into the chat from, so that you're welcome to check them out either during this or after as well. And of course, I'll ask Heather, have a series of questions. Really, the way we've used these forums is to explore some of the themes that sort of emerged as we did this case study research, which really was just meant to be descriptive and start to describe different phenomena that are emerging and how they were doing so. And some of the things that really grabbed Heather as she dug into these case studies. And then, of course, welcome questions from all of you as we dig in, where we can amplify things or clarify certain things that aren't quite clear that would be of interest. So, Heather, I'll dive right in from there, which is two case studies about North Carolina and Alabama, one about connecting North Carolina's schools by extending broadband to all of them, the other about Alabama's statewide online school, which is known as Access. Yet when I read these two case studies, one thing that jumped out at me was that there were some commonalities from the get-go, even though we're talking about two aspects, that there was some similar context, and that they both initiatives got started through questions about the rural school populations in their midst.
That's exactly right, Michael. These are interesting cases in that they have some overlap, which we hadn't entirely anticipated. But both these cases are looking at state-level initiatives to bring greater access to rural populations and to rural students. It's interesting to me because I've actually never lived in a rural area, but in doing this research, I found that 1 in 3 of America's school-aged children attend public schools in rural areas or small towns with fewer than about 25,000 people. So, hearing about race to the top, it's interesting that there's about a third of the U.S. population that's sort of left behind from the start, and that's an issue that both of these cases is grappling with.
That's just a fascinating statistic, and just to put a cap on that again, 1 in 3 students living in a rural context. It's not something we hear a lot about when we do the when we do these when we think about some of the problems that our schools face and a lot of the questions and so forth. So let's dig into the North Carolina question as they thought about rural schools in particular. Why didn't they have internet connectivity in the rural schools? Why did this become a relevant problem? And was it a problem in other places besides rural areas in North Carolina, or was it really rural focus?
Well, here's what the problem was in North Carolina. If you think about the state, right in the center you have the research triangle where you have Wake Forest and Duke and University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and kind of a cluster of the intellectual and economic power for the state. And then you go over to the west and you start hitting more difficult terrain and more sparsely populated area, down to the south, rocky terrain. Internet providers, quite frankly, just did not want to have to dig into rock. And so you find either very few internet service providers or else a natural monopoly with only one. And so they were able to charge extremely high rates. And so consequently, schools particularly in the west and in the south, were finding that they had to pay huge fees to access the internet if they could access it at all. And several times their service also really suffered because of the monopoly. So, for example, some districts reported that it would take them an hour just to upload attendance data because of latency issues that they faced. Even 50 milliseconds of latency caused huge headaches for the districts as they tried to do any of the more sophisticated communications that schools these days are trying to access. So it really became a problem for the state.
It's fascinating now to think about in a lot of the environments in which we live, having problems like that of uploading what would seem to be simple files and so forth. Why did it become so relevant when it did in the time frame for the case? It looked like that it really, internet connectivity had been something that they'd been thinking about through the 90s, through the early 2000s, but it really became an issue in 2006. Was there a confluence of factors that really started to bring that to their attention, or was it just this overwhelming and consistent problems that you were just describing?
There absolutely was a confluence of factors, and factors that I'm finding are replicated in many states across the country right now. For example, the state was trying to launch the North Carolina Virtual Public School, which to date, this is a little preview for what has happened in North Carolina, partly as a result of their connectivity initiative, but to date, the North Carolina Virtual Public School is the second largest state-run online school in the country. And they had that vision for it at the turn of the century, but they just didn't have the telecommunications infrastructure to enable it. They also were finding that there were some real efficiencies to be gained by creating a statewide student information system, wherein the North Carolina Department of Education or Department of Public Instruction could push content and out to schools, and schools could respond with attendance data and that type of thing. But that large enough pipes to get the data back and forth in an efficient way, and it just didn't exist.
So it's really interesting. So it really was 3 or 4 things coming together there. When I read the case study, it seemed like, so they identified this problem then, but they didn't just say, let's solve it tomorrow and be done with it in a year from now. There was really a process in solving this, and both from a staged perspective as well as how they sort of ticked and tacked until they figured out the right solution. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, and that's exactly right. They felt like there was a sense of prioritization. One thing I wanted to mention in terms of the need, if you think about it, some people have had optical fiber that was connecting their districts to the wide area networks pretty efficiently. But there was a percentage of schools, about 10%, that were still dealing with copper telephone lines. If you think about those 56K dial-up modems, or they were literally having their IT directors go out and connect, make a patchwork of antennas, often attaching them to farming silos or radio towers to create a wireless, unlicensed, wide area network for their districts. And so the problem for that percentage, albeit a kind of a small percentage, was really impacting quite a number of students across the state. So with that in mind, the state said, let's get together and create a very methodological, organized way of going out and bringing internet access to our rural communities. And the first thing they did was they said, let's just study the problem. They brought together a group of several agencies and organizations and private companies to study the problem. And that's one of the interesting takeaways from their journey in general, is that they were so aggressive about bringing in public and private agencies as well as federal dollars to solve the problem, and that was their first step. They spent at least a year on a feasibility study and $100,000 just to think through how do we extend broadband, what network resources do we have in place, how do we leverage federal E-rate dollars, that kind of thing. And once they had that done, then they said, we're kind of getting a sense of the problem. Let's now launch a North Carolina connectivity initiative. And that was in 2006, and they were able to secure $6 million from the North Carolina legislature and really start to build out a North Carolina system architecture, which they called the North Carolina EdNet. And it was an interesting model. The EdNet was based on creating a shared education backbone and making sure that each of the districts had access to optical fiber-based wide area networks. They made the participation in this new network architecture completely voluntary so that districts could sign up if they wanted to, which was interesting because it built a market rate into the equation, and districts could shop for a better rate if they found that they were able to secure internet access better, cheaper, faster from a different provider. But generally, the districts started to find, as the initiatives got underway, that it was almost always more compelling to them to join this North Carolina EdNet backbone than to do it on their own. And then thirdly, after they had done the study and they'd started the initiative, then they really started the implementation phase. And that was a 3-year process of building out the backbone, setting up some service bureaus, and making sure that all the infrastructure was in place to be able to roll it out in a prioritized way across the state.
That's a really great overall description. There are a couple things in there that occur to me that are interesting strands for thought. One of them, everyone on this who's here today probably can give a little chuckle for every time they've heard, say we'll form a study group, and the study group comes out with recommendations and nothing happens. But here's something actually happened, and I was interested in the case study that the districts were really skeptical about the state sort of barging in probably with local control dynamics and all the rest. And yet it seemed like the state won them over because, as you said, it wasn't a mandatory thing. It was a voluntary thing. That jumped out at me. I don't know where to go with it, but were there some interesting tidbits that you found there as well about winning over the districts?
Yeah, I think the voluntary nature of it, the opt-in model, was really important. The other thing that they did right was one of their first moves was to set up 2 service bureaus. One was the E-rate service bureau, and probably most people are familiar with E-rate, but it's basically a Federal Communications Commission program to improve, to help fund internet access for schools and libraries across the country. The challenge with E-rate is that it typically is a completely bureaucratic and thorny process to get E-rate funds. For those of you who've experienced that, you're agreeing, I'm sure, that often there's an 18-month lag time between the initial application for E-rate funds and the time that money actually gets in the bank for districts, and it's just really been a headache. And so North Carolina said, let's work together as a state and establish a service bureau and offer it as an option for districts to work together and of E-rate funds per application. And that's exactly what they did. They hired a man named Ed Chase who drove 40,000 miles across the state to win the hearts of the districts, to help them with E-rate, to set up workshops, to answer their questions. And that alone proved to be really compelling for the districts and helps them get on board with the initiative and help them feel like the state for once actually had their best interest in mind. And the second thing that they did was they set up a network engineering service bureau. They were able to get 3 Cisco executives pro bono to actually leave Cisco for a while and just do this as a broadening exercise for them. And it turned out that almost every district in the state ended up using the Network Engineering Service Bureau for troubleshooting and to set up their own, to redesign their local networks. And that proved to be a really popular strategy and win a lot of support from the locals. That's
really helpful. So one other thing that jumped out of this was the public-private partnership, and how they were able to grab resources that weren't necessarily state dollars to support this initiative. I guess I'd ask you to elaborate a little bit more on that, but maybe the bigger question is, you mentioned a number of strands that seem pretty important. Are there ones of these that mattered most, do you think, that were more critical than others to getting this done and successfully so?
Well, absolutely. The finding resource beyond just the state government proved invaluable. As I mentioned, E-rate, the team depended on E-rate to fund about half of their budget, and so turning to the federal government for funds that were already in place, that were already being offered up, but just were not yet being captured. There was only about a 64% capture rate of E-rate funds prior to this initiative. And to turn that around and be able to capture more of that money that was just being left on the table was a huge success for them. They also found that collaborations with private companies worked really well. There was a nonprofit called MCNC that managed the university, the higher education internet infrastructure for the state, called NECRIN. And the initiative did two interesting things. One, they found that they could use NECRIN as the backbone for their system. So they basically piggybacked on the higher education internet infrastructure to as the backbone for their own system. K-12 was not yet very represented on that NECRIN network. And so the state turned to NECRIN and said, let's expand your coverage so that you're not just helping the higher education community, but you're also providing faster internet servicing for the K-12 community. And then the other way that NECRIN was valuable was that NECRIN had relationships with internet service providers like AT&T, Time Warner, CenturyLink, and the initiative found that by partnering with NECRIN to broker group contracts with these internet service providers, they were able to secure much better rates and contracts for internet service than if the districts were negotiating their own third-party suppliers one at a time, as they had been in the past.
I gotcha. One other question that jumped out at me, and then want to maybe transition from there to Alabama, but which is, so there seem to be a lot of things they've learned to capture resources outside of the state, really effective use of existing institutions that maybe weren't working for K-12 in general, really comes out of that discussion loud and clear. What about in terms of sustainability? What happens next? They have broadband into all the schools. It's running successfully. They have a great state office that looks like it continues maybe to handle E-rate requests for upgrades, I guess, is part of it. But what if we have significantly bigger demands in the future? Do we have a feel for that, or is that a concern, and maybe it should be asked to the room how other places have handled that as well. But did you get a feel for that, or is it still a question mark?
No, and that's a great question, Michael, and I'd be interested to hear from the room if others have thoughts about system upgrades. Once an initial backbone is put in place, how do you make sure that it stays up to date? And as we talk about Alabama, we'll talk about that a little bit. When the Federal Communications Commission issued its 2010 National Broadband Report, it suggested that high-speed internet access is about 4 megabits per second or higher. We're finding that in Alabama, which we'll turn to next, they're now looking at providing speeds of up to 50 megabits per second. And so whereas North Carolina touted that they had everyone up at 10 or 20 megabits per second by the time that they were done with this initiative, the question is, how do they continue to manage upgrades, because we're looking at other states that are now looking at 50 megabits per second. So it's an ongoing problem now, and definitely worthy of further research to just observe how North Carolina is managing to, or if they're managing to keep their network up to date now that they've got it in place.
Yeah, I'm just thinking out loud with North Carolina virtual public school becoming so large, content demands on connectivity and speed and so forth becoming more and more and so forth. It seems like that would be a big issue, which is not just to get up to today's speed, but be ahead of wherever it might need to be in the future, particularly as fiber optics and so forth become ever more real and deliver very fast internet speeds and keep the rat race going, if you will. With that and thinking about that link to content, I'd like to transition to Alabama. Of course, to everyone in the chat room, you can always fire questions into the chats, and I'll bring them into the conversation with Heather as well. And we can revisit North Carolina if there's questions as we move on to Alabama. But thinking about Alabama, here in this case study, you really profile the Access program, which maybe first for the people listening, you can tell us what Access stands for, and also again frame the problem here. What problem were they trying to start by solving by starting a what problem were they trying to solve by starting a statewide online school?
Great. Okay. So it's kind of an interesting exercise to put these two cases side by side, because with North Carolina, we're looking at a state that wanted to bring internet infrastructure to their schoolrooms, and now with Alabama, we kind of get a feel for why and the power behind having high-speed connectivity, bringing content to classrooms, even in the most rural areas. Let me give you an example. A gentleman by the name of Larry Raines was principal of Verbena High School, a K-12 school with 550 students. And until Access came to be, there were literally no advanced placement courses at that school. They only offered Spanish 1 and Spanish 2 for foreign languages. And when I asked him about electives, what electives they offered, he said they had two, agri-science and family and consumer science. So I think that was kind of representative of the types of just paucity of courses and curriculum in some of the rural areas, not because of the districts were not trying. It was just that in small areas it's hard to provide a full curriculum with enough teachers to cover all of the different topics that students might want to learn about, and for students even to be able to get an advanced diploma, because they just did not have access to the trigonometry and the other more advanced courses that they needed to be able to succeed. And so Alabama said, you know, we're not really happy with the way we've been facing education. Up until then, their motto was, well, at least we're not Mississippi. And the Governor Riley said, you know, we can do better than this, and we can make Alabama more equitable, even for the people who don't have access to the higher level coursework. And so that was some of the thinking behind the Access initiative, which is for Alabama, connecting classrooms, educators, and schools statewide.
Gotcha. So that's quite an acronym. I see why they called it Access. And that rural story again is you know, that's, I mean, it just keeps hitting you, I guess, in both of these case studies about how significant a problem that is. So they started the Access program, and it looks like they started it with a task force. So there's some similarities there with basically the study group. But then the task force, it seems, to come to something that's maybe less familiar to a lot of people in this room who are used to online learning and using content in new ways and open source and so forth. But there may be you know, they come out with this way of two forms of delivering the courses. One being this video conferencing based instruction, and this other which is really web-based or online learning. How did that come about, and how has it worked out for them? And why these two different systems?
Well, if you have to kind of get in the head of the Access administrators back in 2004 and the task force as they were thinking about putting together this organization to bring access to their schools. What did they know? What they knew was that about 20% of their schools currently had a way of bringing education opportunities to their students when they didn't exist before, and that was through interactive video conferencing, where basically there was a sending school and there were up to 3 receiving schools. And the teacher at the sending school would stand at the front of the classroom. A video projector would capture, a video camera would capture her or his lecture, and then disseminate it to these 3 receiving schools, and the students in those schools would just have to watch the teacher on a big screen in the front of the classroom. And there were microphones and speakers, and it was distance learning in the same way that most of us think about distance learning. Well, this is what the task force also was familiar with. As I said, 20% of the schools already had interactive video conferencing, and they had in their heads, gosh, this is something that we can resonate with. This makes sense for our students. This is a way for some of our students to get access to courses that are already being taught in Alabama, but in schools that our students are not currently attending. And so that was sort of their starting point, but they'd also heard about this new phenomenon called online learning, and they said, why don't we throw some of that in the mix too and experiment with it, even though it's a little scary to us. We don't really understand the idea of an internet platform delivering content or instruction, but we're willing to go there. And so they developed this 2-pronged system of bringing opportunities to their students. 1, interactive video conferencing, which they felt more familiar and comfortable with, but 2, an experimentation with online learning as sort of a new medium that potentially could also offer some benefits for their students.
Gotcha, Heather. So with the video conferencing system specifically, because I found that to be pretty interesting, is how do they equip the schools? What does that cost? So we've just talked about infrastructure with broadband. Now we're talking about a different sort of infrastructure with the video camera and the computers required and so forth. How are they able to do that? And one of the things that some of the people in the chat room are talking about right now in terms of North Carolina is that every time they boost broadband, whether it's 20, 30 megabyte connection, they're hitting 100% capacity almost immediately. So can you give a little bit more insight into those infrastructure needs?
Yep, those are good questions. So equipment and infrastructure, big questions. For equipment, the goal was to equip each of the 371 high schools in Alabama, public high schools, with what they termed a 21st century classroom. And that was an interactive whiteboard, all the equipment they needed for interactive video conferencing, 25 tablet computers, that sort of thing. The budget for those 21st century classrooms was up to $85,000 per school. It ranged from $50,000 to $85,000 depending on what equipment the schools already had in place. 11 schools already had basically 21st century classrooms, so they ended up granting 360 grants ranging from $50,000 to $85,000 to equip these schools with 21st century classrooms. One interesting question from that is, could they have done it cheaper? If they had only done online learning instead of also incorporating interactive video conferencing, what would that have looked like? And it looks like they could have saved between $30,000 to $32,000 per implementation by eliminating some of the interactive video conferencing. But on the other hand, would they have been able to do anything at all? Because the interactive video conferencing was certainly very helpful for them politically to get this through the legislature pretty quickly. In terms of the question about the fact that the size of the pipe seems to be increasing as fast as anything else, and demand seems to just be almost insatiable for high-speed internet access. That certainly has been the experience in Alabama. As part of Alabama's initiative, they contracted with the Alabama Supercomputer Authority, which is the parallel organization to the one I spoke about earlier for North Carolina, the NECRN network. In Alabama, it was called the ARIN network, and it was also a government-funded high-speed network to serve government schools and libraries. And Alabama asked the Alabama Supercomputer Authority, which ran ARIN, to come in and help ensure high-speed connectivity for all of the schools in Alabama who were participating with these 21st century classrooms. And the initial goal was to make sure that each of these 371 high schools had 20 megabits per second of connectivity, but they're now working on getting them up to 50 megabits per second. And I think Alabama has done a pretty good job of ensuring that they have the organizational capacity and priority to continue with these system upgrades using the Alabama Supercomputer Authority to ensure that the capacity, internet capacity, more or less keeps pace with demand, with the caveat that this is government funded, and at any point the budgets could be cut, and that would be that in terms of continuing the system upgrades.
Gotcha. That's interesting. And another part of necessary conditions to deliver this that sort of emerged from this was the training of the teachers. And it seemed like they did in Alabama, a major effort around trying to equip and prepare teachers to be able to work in both environments and the blending of the two environments. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure, and I do think that teacher training is one of the notable aspects of Alabama's program and probably worth focusing in on if anyone wants to read more. But to date, Alabama has trained 659 teachers to equip them with the skills they need to be either video conferencing or web-based instructors. And that's quite a sizable feat, I think. The way they did that was they set up support centers using three different community resources. One was Troy University, the second Madison City Schools, and the third the University of Alabama. And these support centers became the the locus of training for teachers. And teachers basically had to undergo a few days of intensive training, and then they became part of a mentor and protege relationship to learn the ropes from an experienced distance or online learning teacher. And then Access has also really taken advantage of their LMS to provide continual resources and professional development to keep their teaching staff up to date. And so I think they've done an interesting job of really thinking through the teacher training aspect. They've followed INACL's guidelines for the professional development of online teachers, and I think those are worthy of reference just because INACL has done some interesting work thinking about how to equip online teachers with the skills they need. It's a different modality, and teachers need a different set of skills as they're thinking about working in an online environment.
That's very helpful. You're probably listening to my questions. There's a really robust discussion going on right now in the chat room about constraints still on broadband and some of the national broadband plans, if you will, and as well as what the limitations of the word broadband is something interesting that just came out. If people are listening in and have perspectives on this, to get them in the chat room, I think would be great. Either you've dealt with E-rate or you've worked in a district that is being influenced by them. Getting more data out there about the frustrations of this would be really helpful. Heather, I want to turn to something that's near and dear to Steve's heart. Which is course development and content development and so forth. And I was interested in the case study that Alabama sort of took two routes on this. Firstly, they seem to have contracted with a couple providers for perpetual licenses for their courses, and I'd love you to talk through what that means and doesn't mean. And then secondly, they seem to have done a bunch of created a bunch of homegrown courses. Can you talk about that evolution and that process and how that took place?
Sure. So Alabama felt like they wanted to be able to scale the program without being susceptible to too many variable costs. And by saying that, I mean that they wanted to secure perpetual licenses from their providers so that they could they could spread them over as many seats as they wanted without paying incremental dollars per student. And the two vendors that were willing to work with them, or two providers that were willing to work with them based on those terms, were Florida Virtual School and Eventa Learning. So to date, Florida Virtual School has developed 32 courses, and Eventa Learning has developed 13 courses, and those were both on the perpetual license model, meaning that Alabama paid a lump sum for the courses, and they were at liberty to customize them and to extend them to as many students as they wanted. At the same time, their program office, which is housed in the Alabama State Department of Education, has developed a pretty robust system of its own for developing courses. To date, they offer a total of 115 courses, including credit and the not-for-credit remediation courses. And the office has worked pretty extensively, sometimes taking the Florida Virtual School or Eventa Learning courses and then modifying them, sometimes starting from scratch, oftentimes using material from open source places like Hippocampus, and adjusting them for their own needs. Teachers that want to offer a course online are welcome to submit a sample lesson to the program office and then go through a pretty rigorous process with evaluators and just a sophisticated process to ensure that the course is high quality and to see if it passes muster enough that it becomes one of Access's course offerings.
So can I take you back on one thing, which is the licensing of the Florida Virtual School and Eventa courses. When it's a perpetual license, if Florida Virtual School then updates it, does Access get that update, or do you know the answer to that?
My understanding is that they do pay a small fee on an annual basis for the updates. If one of our listeners has more information on that, I'd love to hear it. But my recollection is that there is a small fee that they pay.
Gotcha.
But it's not linked at all to number of students in the class.
Gotcha. Okay, that's helpful. One question from the chat room from Tim. Are these courses delivered in a similar manner to Florida Virtual School, or does the Access program have a different delivery method? So I guess maybe if you can speak to a little bit, so we've heard the video conferencing delivery method of courses in the online learning delivery. So if they're using Florida Virtual School content, would they only be using that in one or the other, or do they adapt it for the video conferencing or do they adapt it for the video conferencing, medium?
Okay, so the video conferencing medium has nothing to do with the Florida Virtual School or Eventa Learning courses. It's completely teacher-based, and it's basically a teacher at the sending school extending his or her lecture to students at other schools. The only addition to that thought, though, is that increasingly Access is encouraging its teachers to blend video conferencing with the online learning. And so the sending school teacher might direct her students to now turn to the learning management system and do some sort of an activity online and then return to the lecture. Or to put an assignment into the Dropbox or something like that. But primarily the virtual school and Eventa Learning content is being used for the online learning portion of Access, this program. And it's staffed by Access teachers, so it's Alabama certified teachers that are providing the online teaching, but it's content that's primarily created by Florida and Eventa Learning with some customization by Alabama that varies. Sometimes very little customization. Sometimes Alabama decides they want to completely redo certain modules in the courses.
Gotcha. Now, some of that obviously is because of distinct Alabama standards. I understand Alabama is one of the states that's adopted Common Core. Yeah, it may be too early to know how that's going to adjust some of their practices, but did you get any insight into that?
I think that Alabama has a pretty robust program office that's in the business right now of customizing content. And so that's what they're doing, and I expect that they will continue to do that. One interesting development, though, is that recently Alabama lifted the seat time requirement, and meaning that students no longer have to complete a certain number of hours of coursework in order to pass the course, but they can demonstrate competency and thereby pass out of a course, which is a great development, in my opinion, for bringing flexibility and self-pacing to Alabama students. With that development, I think that there's the possibility that that Alabama could move in a direction of really embracing high-quality content that will allow students to move through courses as efficiently and effectively as possible and demonstrate that competency in the most agile way possible for each student. And that's an optimistic thing about the lifting of the seat time requirement, is that I think it really potentially could incentivize or free up the system to favor high-quality content.
So the people in the chat room seem to be agreeing that the getting rid of seat time and moving to a competency-based or mastery-based learning system is a breakthrough, to use some people's language. So the natural question follows from that. Florida Virtual School has done that as well, largely getting beyond seat time. And they have an interesting funding model that backs that up. Alabama has a very different funding model from Florida. Can you talk about, obviously talk about it in the context of Alabama, but contrast it a little bit just to paint a picture for the audience?
Sure. Well, Alabama actually has a similar funding model to Florida in its early days. In its early days, Florida was based on a lump sum funding model where there was just a set line item funding allocation from the Florida legislature to fund the whole Florida Virtual School program. In a similar way, Alabama gets a lump sum from the Alabama legislature. It equates to roughly $20 million a year. And to date, they're not really seeing that that's maxing out their ability to meet demand. There haven't been wait lists, and the directors of the program at the state office feel like so far they've pretty much been able to do what they want with that money. They haven't been able to expand the implementation of 21st century classrooms beyond one per high school, but they found that they can meet increased demand for courses by favoring the development of online courses, which don't necessitate 21st century classrooms. They can be done anytime, anywhere. Now the question, though, as you bring out Florida Virtual School, and it's kind of an interesting example, because Florida Virtual School found that eventually they did find capacity constraints, and that the lump sum funding wasn't enough to meet demand, and they transitioned to a per-pupil funding model, which allowed their program to scale in perfect step with student demand, and receive incremental funding for each student who took a course. And the question is whether Alabama will find eventually, and hopefully they will find that their program is so popular and demand is so robust that eventually they'll need incremental dollars per student to make sure that each student has enough budget to cover that extra demand.
That's really interesting. But in essence, they don't get paid on a course-by-course basis then, nor do they get paid if successful completion, as in the Florida model. So that's a significant difference there. So there's a number of questions in the chat room that I want to call out. So one question is, the North Carolina and Alabama courses, do they serve anyone out of state? Do you know the answer to that?
I believe that, I don't know about North Carolina, and we didn't really dive into North Carolina Virtual Public School, but for Alabama Access, my understanding is that it's just students in the state, and it's only public school students, and it does not include homeschool students.
Okay, that's really interesting. Someone else brings up a question of, which is that well, I'll ask it a different way from what they did, but they asked it in terms of teachers and their use of digital content. It seems that actually one of Access's goals going forward is around this question, which is to change the way teachers teach in physical classrooms. Am I reading that correctly? What's up with that, if you will?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Dr. Maddox, who is the current Access administrator in charge of the program in the State Department, she has set as a goal for Access in the future, sort of her next steps for Access are to bring Access tools, the learning management system, and some of the digital learning objects to traditional classrooms so that traditional teachers can use them to potentially enrich or enhance their program. In Institute parlance, these would be considered sustaining technologies because they're just bringing enhancements or potential improvements along the current value proposition of the traditional classroom. And the question is whether or not this will be a good thing for Alabama. I think that sustaining innovation certainly can bring improvements to the current system, but if Alabama is looking for information, it's not just saying, well, at least we're not Mississippi, and they really want to bring transformative change to the students across the state, then my preference would be to continue to make the Access courses themselves compelling and effective and so desirable that students across the state will start finding that they really are motivated to look to the richness of an online or blended environment to bring them their learning in a more efficient and effective and potentially transformative way.
So that's interesting. So they're focusing on trying to get teachers to start to use this content in the classroom, but then not actually changing maybe some of the constraints of what a classroom looks like or the seat time rules that are in place when it's being used there. So it would, in effect, they might have competency-based learning for their courses, but not for the not when the content is being used in that way. It sounds like.
Yeah, I think that if you're thinking about a traditional classroom where by and large the class moves at the same pace with a teacher trying to lead classroom instruction for 30 students relatively in a standardized way, that layering digital learning objects into that curriculum could be slightly enhancing, but potentially not transformative. And so my preference in thinking about the future of Access would be for it to continue to think about how to bring this new medium of online learning to students across the state with the very best coursework and the very best teachers and the very best offerings that they can, and allowing that to continue to get a footing and see if it might become a compelling alternative way for students to get the very best education possible if they're living in a very rural part of southern Alabama.
That's very interesting, and the risk of cramming in our language does seem high. It also seems like by limiting and not allowing the FTE to follow the student, maybe the opportunities to create some really cool blended learning models that make a really effective use of digital content and so forth would be limited maybe as well. We're getting sort of close to the witching hour, as they say. So Heather, I'm curious as you step back from these two cases, both dealing with rural contexts, one very focused on an infrastructure, the other on a broader look that involves infrastructure certainly, and training of teachers and some of these other questions. Were there similarities that just struck you in both? Were there either strengths or weaknesses in both that cut across?
Sure, yeah, and that's been a fun thing about even this opportunity today to speak about these two cases side by side, is that it's really illuminating to me to think about the fact that the 1 in 3 students are in rural schools, and that we're finding 2 states here who are thinking about the fact that there are there is an amazingly new opportunity to embrace some of the virtues of digital learning to potentially transform schools. And they're thinking about how do we build out the infrastructure and the courses and the teachers and all of the pieces that it takes to give our students access to these opportunities. One thing that was striking to me is that in both cases they were governor initiated. In North Carolina, it was at the time Lieutenant Governor Perdue, who is now the acting governor of North Carolina, and in Alabama it's Governor Riley, and they both chose high-profile task forces of people who were able to have the legislative heft to make things happen quickly. They chose high-profile people, both from the public and the private sector, to come together as heavyweight teams in our parlance and create a new process for delivering education to students. In North Carolina, a woman by the name of Myra Best, who was an assistant to the governor, was considered the hammer because she really just drove through the legislation. And in both states, it took that type of charismatic and dedicated leadership from the upper levels of the government, the state government, this just happened. So I think there's other states are thinking about it. It's going to take leadership from the top. And then the thing that has just really resonated with me is that the infrastructure is such an important piece in building a groundwork for the transformation to take place. And right now we see North Carolina Virtual School, which is the second largest state-run virtual school in the country. And in Alabama, the Access Program is the third largest state-run virtual school in the country. In both instances, as they did their business to get the infrastructure in place, potentially there's an argument that it's just not a coincidence that now they both have pretty robust state virtual schools.
Great. Well, I think with that, we ought to start to wrap up. But I just want to thank everyone once again, and thank you, Heather, for providing us such a good both summary of each of these case studies and what they were doing in North Carolina to bring connectivity to all of the schools that could handle this burgeoning internet needs and so forth. And then in Alabama to actually solve what was a big problem with a lot of rural students not having access to courses and so forth, and what else that brought about, and tying it together then with these similarities. And thank you to the audience with some great commentary in the background, both about the challenges and where things have gotten stuck up, and some exciting opportunities as well that I see out of here as well. So as always, thank you, Heather, thank you to the audience, and thank you to Steve for allowing us to host it. And Steve, I will kick it back to you so you can tell them what's coming up next.
I'm wondering if you're hearing me. Am I back on? Anyway, thanks to both of you. That was terrific. Again, Michael, always interesting to see what comes out of Innosight and the ways in which you inform the conversation. Thanks to Illuminate Nerd Central. And coming up next week, Jim Klein on social networking and our panel on unschooling. I'm going to clap again. There's the clapping hand at the bottom of your participant window that lets you clap. Thank you so much, Michael and Heather. So, Michael, can you hear me? I'm wondering if my audio came through.
Yep, I can hear you, Steve, loud and clear.
Okay, good. That was sure fun. Really appreciate it, and appreciate the work that you do there. And thanks for coming on. Okay, so we're going to close up now. Heather, thank you again. Thanks for figuring out the phone situation.